There is something deeply unsettling about the human condition. We walk through life believing ourselves to be free, making choices, pursuing dreams, building identities. Yet beneath the surface of this presumed freedom lies a labyrinth of invisible chains, subtle, ancient, and profoundly effective at keeping the spirit imprisoned. The great Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi understood this truth with piercing clarity. He saw that most human beings live their entire lives in a prison they cannot see, bound by chains they cannot feel, suffering from a captivity they mistake for liberty. These chains are not made of iron or steel. They are woven from the fabric of consciousness itself, from desire, from fear, from the ego's desperate need to exist. They wrap around the heart so gently that we often mistake their grip for comfort. They whisper in our minds so convincingly that we believe their lies are our own thoughts. And perhaps most tragically, they convince us that the walls of our prison are actually the boundaries of reality itself. Ibn Arabi, born in Andalusia in the 12th century, spent his life exploring the hidden dimensions of human consciousness. His writings reveal a man who had journeyed deep into the interior landscape of the soul and returned with maps of territories most people never know exist. He understood that the greatest battle is not fought on external battlefields, but within the secret chambers of the heart. He knew that liberation is not a matter of changing one's circumstances, but of transforming one's relationship with existence itself. What makes these chains so insidious is their invisibility. A prisoner who can see his chains may work to break them. A captive who knows he is imprisoned may seek escape. But what of the prisoner who believes himself free? What of the one who mistakes his cell for the entire universe? This is the condition of most human beings, according to Ibn Arabi. Not criminals locked away, but souls wandering in a prison so vast they cannot perceive its walls, bound by chains so subtle they feel like part of themselves. The first chain that binds the spirit is attachment. The heart, Ibn Arabi teaches, was created to belong to the divine alone, yet most people fill it with loves that are temporary, conditional, fragile. We attach ourselves to wealth, believing it will bring security. We cling to relationships, believing they will complete us. We grasp at status, possessions, achievements, building our sense of self upon foundations that can crumble in an instant. And when these things are taken away, as they inevitably will be, we discover how profoundly dependent we have become. The pain we feel is not merely loss, but the revelation of how completely we had chained ourselves to what was never truly ours. Attachment is like tying your heart to a moving boat. The waves rise and fall, and as the boat shakes, your heart shakes with it. One financial loss and we collapse. One betrayal and we lose ourselves. One disappointment and we fall into despair. This is the nature of attachment. It makes us fragile, vulnerable, constantly anxious about preserving what we cannot control. We become slaves to our possessions rather than their masters. We serve what should serve us. And in this inversion, freedom is lost. Yet Ibn Arabi does not call us to reject life or to abandon love. The purification he speaks of is not about denial, but about transformation. It is possible to love without attachment, to enjoy without grasping, to appreciate without clinging. When the heart belongs fully to the divine, when it is anchored in what is eternal and unchanging, then the temporary losses of this world can no longer destroy you. You become free, not from life, but free within it. The second chain is the ego's relentless hunger for recognition. The nafs, as Ibn Arabi calls it, is like a restless animal that constantly demands to be fed, praised, validated. It whispers continuously, "You are what others think of you. Your value depends on their approval. Your worth is measured by your reputation." And so we spend our lives chasing the opinions of others, terrified of rejection, devastated by criticism, addicted to praise. We construct elaborate masks and perform exhausting roles, all to maintain an image we believe defines us. The ego thrives on comparison. It pushes you to measure yourself against others constantly. Who has more wealth? Who commands more respect? Who appears more successful? But this comparison is an endless race with no finish line. The moment you rise above one person, the ego shows you someone higher. The moment you achieve one goal, it insists it is not enough. This is why people feel empty even after success, why accomplishment brings no lasting peace, because the ego can never be satisfied. Its hunger is infinite because it feeds on illusion. When you detach from the ego's demands, something extraordinary happens. Insults no longer burn you because you know they cannot touch what is real in you. Praise no longer intoxicates you because you understand it changes nothing essential. You become free from the exhausting performance of maintaining an image. You discover that your true worth was never dependent on external validation. It exists independent of all opinion, rooted in your essential nature as a reflection of the divine. The third chain is fear, not the natural fear that protects us from danger, but the existential anxiety that permeates modern life. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness. This fear operates like a prison guard, keeping us confined within narrow boundaries of safety. It prevents us from speaking truth, from taking necessary risks, from living authentically. We make choices not based on what is right or what calls to us, but based on what feels safe, what avoids confrontation, what minimizes the possibility of pain. Ibn Arabi understood that this fear is rooted in forgetfulness of our true nature, forgetfulness of the divine presence that permeates all existence. When we forget that we are part of something infinite and eternal, when we believe ourselves to be merely these fragile bodies moving through a hostile universe, fear becomes inevitable. We feel isolated, vulnerable, alone. Every threat appears existential because we have identified ourselves with what can be threatened. But when we remember, when we awaken to the reality that we are expressions of the divine, that our essential nature is beyond birth and death, beyond gain and loss, then fear loses its power. Not because dangers disappear, but because we understand that what we truly are cannot be destroyed. The body may be harmed, possessions may be lost, but the spirit remains untouched, eternal, free. This remembrance, which Ibn Arabi calls dhikr, is not merely intellectual knowledge, but a lived reality, a state of consciousness that transforms one's relationship with existence. The fourth chain is anger, the fire that burns within the chest, destroying peace and clarity. Anger arises when reality refuses to conform to our expectations, when people fail to behave as we believe they should, when events unfold in ways we find unacceptable. It is a form of rebellion against what is, a denial of reality itself. And in this denial we suffer. Ibn Arabi does not teach the suppression of anger, but its transformation. The energy that manifests as destructive rage can be purified into righteous indignation for justice. The heat that burns can be directed toward positive change, rather than mere destruction. But this transformation requires awareness, the ability to observe anger arising without immediately identifying with it, without believing that the emotion defines you or justifies your actions. When anger controls us, we become its slave. We say things we later regret. We damage relationships we value. We make decisions from a place of distortion that we must live with long after the anger has subsided. The temporary satisfaction of expressing rage is purchased at the cost of lasting consequences. But when we learn to witness anger, to feel it without being possessed by it, we discover that emotions are like weather. They arise, they persist for a time, and they pass. We do not need to act on every emotion we feel. We can choose our response rather than being carried away by reaction. The fifth chain is greed, the belief that more is always better, that satisfaction lies just beyond what we currently possess. Greed is insatiable by its very nature. It is not about needing more, but about wanting more, an endless appetite that can never be filled. 1 million is not enough. We need 2. 2 million is insufficient. We require 10. And on it goes, an infinite regression where the finish line perpetually recedes as we approach it. Ibn Arabi teaches that greed arises from a poverty of spirit, an inner emptiness that seeks to be filled with external things. But material abundance cannot satisfy spiritual hunger. You cannot cure a disease of the soul with possessions. The more we accumulate in an attempt to fill the inner void, the more we discover that the void remains. And worse, we become enslaved to what we have accumulated, anxious about losing it, constantly working to maintain and increase it, never at peace. True wealth, according to Ibn Arabi, is contentment, the ability to be satisfied with what suffices, to appreciate what is, rather than constantly longing for what is not. This does not mean settling for poverty or abandoning ambition. It means recognizing that beyond a certain point, more possessions do not bring more happiness. They bring more complexity, more anxiety, more chains. The richest person is not the one who has the most, but the one who needs the least, who has learned that the deepest satisfactions come not from accumulation, but from presence, gratitude, and connection with the divine. The sixth chain is heedlessness, ghafla in Arabic, the state of spiritual sleepwalking that characterizes most human life. We go through our days on autopilot, lost in distraction, absorbed in trivialities, unconscious of the deeper dimensions of existence. We are like people walking through a magnificent gallery with our eyes closed, stumbling past masterpieces we never see, deaf to music that surrounds us. This heedlessness is perhaps the most fundamental chain because it prevents us from even recognizing our imprisonment. When we are spiritually asleep, we cannot perceive the other chains that bind us. We live on the surface of life, engaged with appearances while remaining blind to essences. We know the names of things, but not their meanings. We experience existence but do not truly live. Ibn Arabi's path is fundamentally about awakening from this sleep. The practices he teaches, meditation, contemplation, dhikr, are all methods of cultivating presence, of learning to be awake in the moment rather than lost in the past or future, trapped in thoughts, dreams, fantasies. When we awaken, we begin to see reality as it truly is, rather than through the distorted lens of our conditioning. We perceive the divine presence that permeates all existence. We recognize that every moment is sacred, that the ordinary contains the extraordinary, that the visible world is a manifestation of invisible realities. The seventh chain is identification with the limited self. We believe ourselves to be this name, this body, this personality, this collection of memories and characteristics. We define ourselves by our nationality, our profession, our relationships, our achievements. And in doing so, we trap ourselves in a cage far smaller than our true nature. Ibn Arabi teaches that the self we think we are is merely a mask, a role we play, a temporary garment worn by something infinite. Our true identity is not separate from the divine, but a unique expression of it. We are like waves believing themselves to be separate from the ocean, technically distinct, yet essentially one, arising from the same source, made of the same substance, destined to return to the same unity. When we identify with the limited self, we suffer its limitations. We feel inadequate, incomplete, vulnerable. We experience ourselves as isolated beings in a universe of separate things, constantly in competition, always defensive, perpetually anxious about survival and status. But when we awaken to our true nature, when we realize that we are not merely in the universe, but that the universe is in us, that we are not separate from the divine but expressions of it, then the walls of the prison collapse. We discover that we are far more vast than we imagined, that our boundaries are not rigid but permeable, that separation is an illusion maintained by limited perception. The eighth chain is certainty about what we know. The mind loves conclusions, final answers, settled questions. Uncertainty feels uncomfortable, so we rush to establish firm positions, clear beliefs, definite opinions. We become attached to our understanding of reality and defend it against all challenges. But this certainty is a prison that prevents further growth, deeper understanding, continued revelation. Ibn Arabi speaks of the station of bewilderment, hayra in Arabic, not as a problem to be solved, but as a higher state of consciousness. When we realize how little we truly understand, when we recognize that every answer opens new questions, when we embrace mystery rather than fleeing into premature conclusions, we remain open to truth. We do not trap ourselves in rigid ideologies or fixed perspectives. We allow reality to continuously reveal itself in new ways. This is not an invitation to skepticism or relativism, but to intellectual humility and spiritual openness. The more deeply one understands, the more one realizes the vastness of what remains unknown. The wise person is not the one with all the answers, but the one comfortable with questions, able to hold contradictions, willing to be transformed by truth, even when it challenges cherished beliefs. The ninth chain is resentment, the poison we drink hoping someone else will suffer. Resentment is the refusal to forgive, the endless replaying of past hurts, the cultivation of grievances. It keeps us tethered to the past, unable to be present, imprisoned by events that are finished, controlled by people who may not even remember what they did. Ibn Arabi teaches that forgiveness is not primarily for the benefit of those who hurt us, but for our own liberation. When we hold on to resentment, we carry the burden. When we refuse to forgive, we remain chained to what wounded us. The act of forgiveness is not saying that what happened was acceptable. It is releasing our grip on it, letting it belong to the past rather than continuing to live in it. This requires a profound shift in perspective. It means understanding that those who harm us are themselves imprisoned, acting from their own pain, ignorance, and suffering. It means recognizing that holding on to anger hurts us far more than it affects them. It means choosing freedom over the bitter satisfaction of nursing our wounds. And most profoundly, it means trusting that justice belongs to the divine, that we do not need to be the ones who settle every score, that we can release our need for revenge and trust in a larger order. The 10th chain is the illusion of control. We believe we can and should control our lives, our circumstances, our futures, the behavior of others, even our own thoughts and emotions. And so we exhaust ourselves in constant effort to manipulate reality, to force outcomes, to prevent what we fear and secure what we desire. When things do not go according to our plans, we experience anxiety, frustration, a sense of failure. But Ibn Arabi teaches tawakkul, trust in the divine, surrender to what is beyond our control. This is not passivity or fatalism. It is not an excuse to avoid effort or abdicate responsibility. It is the recognition that despite our best efforts, outcomes are ultimately not in our hands. We can plant seeds, but we cannot force them to grow. We can take actions, but we cannot determine all their consequences. We can make plans, but reality is under no obligation to conform to them. When we surrender the illusion of control, we discover a profound peace. We continue to act, but without the crushing anxiety about results. We do what seems right and necessary, then release our attachment to specific outcomes. We learn to distinguish between what is genuinely within our power, our choices, our efforts, our responses, and what lies beyond it. This distinction brings both clarity and serenity. These 10 chains, attachment, ego, fear, anger, greed, heedlessness, false identification, rigid certainty, resentment, and the illusion of control, bind the human spirit in a prison more effective than any constructed of stone and steel. They operate invisibly, enforced not by external guards but by our own unconsciousness. We are simultaneously the prisoner and the jailer, locked in a cage whose key we carry without knowing it. Ibn Arabi's path is one of liberation, not escape from life but freedom within it. He does not call us to reject the world, but to purify our relationship with it. He teaches that we can live fully engaged with existence while remaining inwardly free, participating completely while attached to nothing, loving deeply without being enslaved by our loves. This is the paradox at the heart of his teaching. True freedom is found not in getting what we want, but in transcending the tyranny of wanting itself. The process of liberation begins with recognition. We must first see the chains before we can break them. We must acknowledge our imprisonment before we can seek escape. This requires brutal honesty, the willingness to look clearly at how we have been living, to recognize the patterns that trap us, to admit the ways we collaborate in our own captivity. It is painful to see how much of what we thought was freedom was actually just a larger cage. How many of our choices were not truly free but conditioned responses. How thoroughly we have been shaped by forces we never questioned. But this recognition, painful as it may be, is also the beginning of transformation. When we see clearly, we can act differently. When we understand the nature of our chains, we can begin the work of breaking them. And this work, Ibn Arabi teaches, is not merely personal development or psychological healing. It is a spiritual journey, a path of return to our original nature, a remembrance of what we have always been beneath the layers of forgetting. The methods are ancient yet eternally relevant. Meditation to cultivate presence and awareness. Contemplation to deepen understanding. Dhikr to maintain remembrance of the divine. Service to transcend the prison of self-absorption. Community to mirror our blind spots and support our growth. Study to illuminate the path. And perhaps most importantly, a teacher or guide who has walked this path before, who can help us navigate the subtle territories of consciousness where it is so easy to become lost or deceived, but no method, no practice, no teacher can do the work for us. Liberation is not something that can be given. It must be achieved. The chains are invisible, which means the work of breaking them must happen in the invisible realm of consciousness itself. We must change not our circumstances, but our relationship with them, not what we experience, but how we experience it, not the content of our lives, but the quality of our presence within them. This is why Ibn Arabi's path is so demanding. It requires constant vigilance, continuous self-examination, unwavering commitment. The ego is clever and persistent. It learns to disguise itself in spiritual language, to mimic awakening, to create subtle new prisons that feel like freedom. We can replace gross chains with more refined ones, trading obvious attachments for spiritual pride, exchanging worldly desires for religious ambitions, substituting one form of imprisonment for another. The true test of progress is not how spiritual we feel, but how free we are. Free from reactivity, free from the need for validation, free from attachment to outcomes, free from identification with temporary states, free from the compulsive patterns that once controlled us. This freedom manifests as peace that is not dependent on circumstances, joy that does not require external stimulation, love that is not conditional on being loved in return, clarity that remains undisturbed by confusion around it. And yet, even speaking of this freedom risks creating another subtle trap. If we make liberation into a goal to be achieved, an accomplishment to be earned, a future state to be reached, then we have simply created another chain, the chain of spiritual ambition, of seeking, of believing that we are not yet what we need to be. Ibn Arabi's most radical teaching is that we are already free, that liberation is not something to be attained but recognized, that the prison exists only in our perception. The chains are real in their effects, but illusory in their essence. They have no power except what we give them. They bind us only because we do not see through them. When perception shifts, when consciousness awakens, when we see clearly what has always been true, the chains simply fall away. Not through force or effort, but through recognition. Like someone who suddenly realizes they have been dreaming, the nightmare ends not through struggle, but through awakening. This is the secret Ibn Arabi points toward, but cannot simply give us. Words can indicate the direction, but each person must make the journey. Teachings can illuminate the path, but we must walk it ourselves. The truth can be spoken, but it must be lived to be real. Knowledge about freedom is not the same as freedom itself. So we return to where we began, to the uncomfortable recognition that most human beings live their entire lives in a prison they cannot see, bound by chains they cannot feel, suffering from a captivity they mistake for liberty. But now perhaps we see this not as a condemnation, but as an invitation. The prison door is unlocked. It always has been. We need only see this clearly enough to walk through it. What would your life look like if you were free from these 10 chains? If attachment no longer made you fragile? If ego no longer demanded constant feeding? If fear no longer kept you confined? If anger no longer controlled your responses? If greed no longer drove your choices? If you lived awake rather than sleepwalking? If you knew your true nature rather than identifying with the limited self? If you remained open rather than trapped in rigid certainty? If you released resentment and embraced forgiveness? If you surrendered the exhausting illusion of control? This is not a fantasy or an impossible ideal. It is the natural state of consciousness freed from distortion, the human being living in alignment with their deepest nature. It is what Ibn Arabi and countless others have demonstrated is possible. Not easy, not quick, not achievable through casual effort, but possible, real, available. The question is not whether liberation is attainable, but whether you are willing to do what it requires. Are you willing to see clearly, even when what you see is uncomfortable? Are you willing to question everything, even your most cherished beliefs? Are you willing to sit with uncertainty rather than fleeing into premature conclusions? Are you willing to feel your emotions fully without being controlled by them? Are you willing to let go of what no longer serves you, even if it feels like losing part of yourself? Are you willing to live differently than almost everyone around you, to walk a path that few even recognize exists? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the real questions that determine whether the chains will remain or break, whether the prison will persist or dissolve, whether your life will be lived in the small cage of conditioned existence or the vast freedom of awakened consciousness. Ibn Arabi's gift to us is not comfort or easy answers. It is the uncomfortable truth that we are not as free as we believe, accompanied by the extraordinary promise that we can be far more free than we imagine. The invisible chains that imprison the spirit can be broken. The prison that seems so solid can dissolve. The limited self we think we are can be transcended. But this requires work, real work, inner work, the most important work a human being can undertake. In the silence between these words, in the space where reading ends and living begins, the real question waits. Not, is this true? Oh, but what will I do with this truth? Not, is liberation possible? But, am I willing to pay its price? Not, could I be free? But will I choose freedom? The chains are invisible, but they are not invincible. They persist only in unconsciousness. When consciousness awakens, when we see clearly, when we choose freedom over familiarity and truth over comfort, the chains fall away. Not someday in a distant future, but now, in this moment, the only moment there ever is. Ibn Arabi mapped the territory. He described the chains, he pointed toward freedom, but he cannot walk the path for you. That journey is yours alone. It has always been yours. It is waiting for you now.